Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Phil Howard, co-director with a wonderful colleague, Professor Nielsen, co-director of the Martin School program on media science and misinformation, and it's a pleasure to help host, bring you all together to celebrate his work and celebrate the publication of the platforms, the power of platforms. This room is an important room for us because for several years we held meetings between prominent policymakers and the technology firms themselves, trying to give these colleagues and associates some time together out of the public eye to work on the grand challenges that social media was presenting for public life. Those meetings were tough. There were tears and there was yelling. These were fully off the record, so I won't say more than that except to say that one of the things I learned is that there's often a difference between the kinds of things that individuals we were working with the firms would say, how they would respond to some of the big grand issues taken up in the book, and how the businesses would act as large corporations. And I find that's one of the masterful things that Rasmus handles very well in this book. So we're here to hear his latest thinking, perhaps look ahead, talk a bit about what the book might mean for the future. Rasmus, the floor is yours. Oh, a little logistics first. This is being recorded and broadcast live, so keep that in mind when you ask questions. Ringers off, of course. There will be books for sale at the back of the room, at the end of the talk, along with drinks and nibbles for those of us to help facilitate more conversation. Now, join me in welcoming Rasmus.
Thank you very much, Phil, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for finding the time to join here today. What I want to do is to walk through some of the key aspects of the book, The Power of Platforms, that Oxford University Press published last year, co-authored with my former colleague, Sarah Ann Gander, who's now at Simon Fraser University in Canada. I'll draw out some of the key arguments we make in that book. It's a wide-ranging argument, so there'll be some highlights of the different aspects we discuss in greater details in the book, so we can take the conversation in many different directions. And towards the end of it, I will also offer a few observations and things that have happened since we finished the research and since the book itself was published, about how I think that some of the arguments we make can inform our thinking around things that are currently happening in our society and that might happen in the future. The occasion, if you will, for the book, as the name suggests, is the rise of platform companies in our societies. Platform companies are companies such as Google, its equally large, nearly equally large consumer-facing competitor, now called Meta, then called Facebook. Three other very large US-based tech companies with different sort of fiefdoms based out of e-commerce, out of enterprise software, out of the hardware and operating system, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple. And then a range of smaller and medium-sized competitors, Twitter, now known as X, Reddit, Yahoo, Spotify, TikTok, Snap, Telegram, and their counterparts elsewhere in the world, mainland China, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, the so-called BAT cartel, Naver, Daum, Yahoo Japan, South Korea, and Japan, who have all risen to great, or at least some prominence in the last 25 years or so, in a world where I think we can say that the internet made information available to us, but platforms have made it accessible to us, that we increasingly rely on companies such as these to orient ourselves in the online environment. These companies, we argue in the book, have some things in common. They are technology companies, some of them very large, that have developed and maintained digital platforms that enable interactions between at least two different kinds of actors, normally as a minimum each of us, you, me, as end users, and then advertisers who want to have a share of our attention. But it can be many others as well, developers who offer us games or apps, private companies or public authorities or individuals who want to reach us and post content to the platforms and the like. So at least two different, but often more than two different kinds of actors. In the process of developing and offering these platforms, they come to host public information, organize access to it, create new formats for it, and control data about it. And thereby they influence the incentive structures around investment in public communication, including news production, the particular case that we look at in the book. Now, many different kinds of platforms have at least these features in common, the same way that we might say that many different kinds of news media have some features in common, even as they are also different and competing. And that last bit, competing, I think is also something we need to keep in mind when you think about the role of platform companies in our societies. There are moments where it's important to stress the commonalities, to accentuate the similarities, and where we can usefully use terms such as big tech to refer to a small number of very large US-based for-profit companies that organize much of the media environment we operate in. But they are also one another's major competitors. They are engaged in what the former Google CEO, Eric Schmidt, called the platform wars. So similarities, but also they are fundamentally one another's main competitors. Now, in the book, Sarah and I focus specifically on the relationship between platform companies and news publishers. Our interest in that really sort of started from the idea that, in a sense, news publishers could be a paradigmatic case or even a sort of an early example of what the rise of these platform companies might mean for many other areas of life, and also perhaps a particularly important one because news publishers are the industry that historically occupied the commanding heights of our media environment and now find themselves face to face with these relatively new entrants who in turn have come to play a similar role that the news media now have to find themselves their own place in this transformed world. The impact of the rise of platforms and news publishing, I think we can sort of capture some key aspects before we get into the details of the qualitative work we do in the book of tracing the historical development of this relationship, of analyzing interviews with different kinds of publishers, different kinds of platforms talking about this relationship, and analyzing in greater details the more distinct forms of platform power that we argue that the platform companies have come to exercise. But some simple things I think are worth carrying with us as we begin to examine this relationship. The first one is that we live in a world in which we have, in a relatively short period of time, gone from a world where news discovery was primarily direct. If you wanted to access news about the world, you would go directly to a channel that was controlled by the publisher of the news content you were interested in. You might pick up a printed copy of a newspaper, you might tune into a radio channel or a broadcast channel, or you might go directly to the website of a news publisher. But the world in which we live in today is increasingly one that is characterized by distributed discovery, where the channels we use to access the information are controlled by different entities from the publishers who produce the information. So every year at the Reuters Institute, which I have the honor of directing, we do a big survey of news and media users across the world, and we ask people lots of different questions, including how they access online news. Most internet users will access news online in a couple of different ways, and then we'll ask the follow-up question of which of the ways in which they say they access news is their main way of accessing news. These are the averages across 46 markets, accounting for more than half of the world's population last year. Just 23% of internet news users say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of getting news online. And a clear majority rely on various forms of distributed access where people go sideways, often via platforms controlled by large platform companies, social media, primarily Facebook, Instagram, and a couple of other platforms, search, overwhelmingly Google search, or aggregators. This can be Apple News, Google News, or some of the smaller competitors, right? So a fundamental change in discovery, from direct discovery to distributed discovery as the primary way in which most people get news online. This is the first major impact that publishers have had to come to terms with. The second impact, driven by our choices as media users, it's not that we can't get a newspaper at the tuck shop anymore, it's that most of us don't and get our news in other ways. The second impact is the consequence of this for the advertising economy that news publishers relied on. In English-speaking countries, the majority of the revenue of the news industry came from advertising till very recently. But in an online environment where news publishers no longer control a large share of our attention, they have less to sell, and advertisers are moving their money elsewhere where they find they can get more attention and can get cheap and targeted advertising at scale. Google and Facebook as the two largest beneficiaries of this, on their own, even well before the present day, came to account for nearly half or more than half of all online advertising globally, just two companies, right? And everybody else, literally everybody else, not just news publishers, but every other seller of advertising competes for the rest. So move from direct to distributed discovery and a fundamental change in the media economy as advertising that historically in part went to news publishers overwhelmingly now goes to platforms. Now, the same way that we as consumers didn't start using search engines, social media, and aggregators with a deliberate intent of disrupting the news industry, advertisers aren't moving their money to platforms with the deliberate intent of disrupting the news industry. It's just that they aren't primarily interested in news. They're interested in our attention. And if our attention is moved, so will their money. Now, these two big shifts are part of the backdrop of the situation that we analyze in the book. But as we interviewed people who work in publishers, we found that there was something more going on. And I think this something more is worth unpacking a little bit, because this might be one of the aspects of the book where it can speak beyond the role of platform companies vis-a-vis news publishing, and also help us think about the role these companies play when it comes to public discourse more broadly, politicians expressing themselves, social movements, advocacy organizations, interest groups, science communication, really anyone trying to raise their voice in a mediated online space. And that is what we try to capture with this notion of the power of platforms. Now, of course, some of this involves forms of power that are well understood by social scientists that we've known about for a long time. Some of these companies are large and have a lot of money. They exercise hard power in ways that are very familiar to us. They have lawyers, they have lobbyists, they will fight their corner the way that every big corporation will fight their corner. In Brussels, in DC, in London, and elsewhere, they will come after their critics using PR and other instruments. This is the way in which large corporations carry themselves. Volkswagen, Boeing, Airbus are not fundamentally different. They also have, to various degrees and much diminished since the 2016 election with the concern around Russian information operations, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and other increasingly critical scrutiny, in particular Facebook, but also of some of its competitors. They still have various forms of soft power where there is a sort of an aura around at least some of these companies that seems to draw some people in. I mean, not so long ago, in this country, we were witness to the slightly embarrassing spectacle of the Prime Minister interviewing Mr. Musk, as I think is sort of a reminder of how frequent it was the case not so long ago that very prominent politicians were very keen to appear in the company of these titans of Silicon Valley. But what we identify in the book is something more specific than that, and something we think is new, which is what we call platform power. Platform power, we argue, is deeply relational. It's based on attraction, on platform companies' control and development of means of connection, inclusive means of connection, not exclusive means of production. It's an enabling, transformative, and productive form of power. And it is a form of power that is tied to the institutional and strategic interests of the platform companies themselves. Now, those of you who are sort of steeped in social theory of power might spot here that there are lots of theorists who would argue that all forms of power are enabling, transformative, productive, and relational. But I suppose our argument here is that it's particularly important to be attentive to these dimensions when it comes to the role of platform power and how it operates, but that in contrast to some of these theoretical arguments, these are not what Michel Foucault called strategies without strategists. They are forms of power that are exercised by precise, specific companies with specific interests and agendas. They may not know themselves, they may not have clarity and precision about what they want and how they carry themselves in the world, but they are actors. They are not just systems. Now, a fundamental driver of platform power, we argue in the book, is that each of us as users, but also every publisher and other third-party complementer that engages with platforms help make them powerful, and we do so because they empower us in specific ways when we use their products and services. We use platforms and publishers use platforms when and because they can help us accomplish things we would like to accomplish. I can find information, I can stay in sort of have a sense of being in touch with friends and family, I can email people using platform products and services. But in the process of being empowered to do these things more easily than I might otherwise have been able to, I also become more dependent upon them. And I shudder at the thought of what would happen if Gmail disappeared while I was giving this talk, and what disarray much of my life would be left in. The power we analyze in the book, we argue takes sort of 5 important aspects. I will just briefly illustrate them. And again, I said this is sort of a whistle-stop tour of a wider argument, and we can take this in any direction that you find useful when we turn to the questions and discussion. But just briefly, the 5 aspects we highlight in the book, and I'll illustrate them with examples from Google as the one of the oldest, and for news publishers, probably the single most important platform company. First of all, platforms have the power to set standards. This is a screenshot of what used to be called the first click free policy that Google operated for a long time. This was the principle that if a website is indexed in search, as a user of the search engine, you should be able to access the first click for free. This is a standard that Google set that, from the point of view of publishers, was a platform company essentially dictating to commercial partners what their pricing should be. It should be free for the first click. From the point of view of Google, this was a special privilege that Google offered to news publishers as a subset of all the websites it indexed, because it was a partial exemption from what was called the no-cloaking policy, that you were not allowed to show one thing to the crawler indexing the sites, this is the content, and then if people tried to access it, show them something else, namely a paywall, not the content, right? As long as the first click was free, you were allowed to maintain the paywall and still get the content indexed. But from the point of view of the publishers, this was the platform dictating to them how to price. So platforms have the power to set standards. They have the power to make and break connections in the networks that they enable. The most sort of visible example of them exercising this power is when they make the periodic algorithm changes, the ranking algorithms. They make hundreds of these every year. Some of them are sort of large enough that they will announce them publicly, have a blog post, and sort of give them a name. This is just an old example of when Google was facing what it perceived to be the problem of so-called content farms, companies such as Demand Media, Ask.com, and others, that produced very cheap articles that were essentially reverse engineers from what people were searching for. But Google's impression was that users generally didn't find these articles or pages particularly useful or high quality, and therefore Google changed the search algorithm to privilege what it called high quality sites in search at the expense of these content farms. When there are such changes, there are winners and losers. The losers are often very visible because they'll identify themselves and complain about the changes, right? And Demand Media lost about 70% of its market value in weeks after this change. The company had briefly been bigger than the New York Times company and was essentially thrown entirely by its relying on search when search changed. But there will also be winners, right? There are other sites that then get a bigger share of the attention that the search engine directs. Platforms have the power of what we rather inelegantly perhaps call automated action at scale. It's really, really important to always keep in mind that there are people and organizations behind these technologies. They're not natural processes, they're not impersonal forces, but they are still technologies, right? And that part of the power of platforms come through their ability to automate. And that automation means that we as end users can search for something curious like automated action at scale, and in less than a second, we can get a rank order of more than 164 million websites based on a probabilistic assessment of its possible relevance for our search query. There is something newish going on here when this can happen so quickly. Not unique, not entirely novel, but newish going on here, and it's happening at scale every day. And it's not just for us as end users, right? It's also for advertisers. So this is another screenshot from a Google product. This is from the advertising side, right? If you want to sell or buy advertising and you want to do it through Google AdSense, for example, as a programmatic advertising exchange, you don't need to call someone. You don't need to send a pitch. You don't need to write what you want to do. You can do it through a self-serve system. that automates a lot of this. There is something new going on here and that we think is distinct to platforms. There is something here about secrecy, about opacity and information asymmetry. Most of the platform companies will offer at least some sort of explanation of some of the principles behind what they do. So if, on Google you could find this how search works infographic, for example, and it'll sort of give you lots of things. And of course, by paying attention to it, you'll learn a bit more about how search works, but it'll still fundamentally be opaque to you. And while search probably is opaque to Google as well, it is certainly less opaque to Google than it is to anybody else. So there is here something about secrecy and information opacity. And finally, platform power is often exercised and operating across different domains. So you might have a very popular search engine, then you might acquire a video sharing site, you might have programmatic advertising exchanges, an email client, and maps, and many, many other things, all of which feed into a shared infrastructure of data, all of which draws on the same pool of engineering talent, all of which can be powered through the money you make from your core products that allow you to invest and make bets on the future. So 5 aspects of platform power that we outline in the book. Now, if you are a publisher, and in a relatively short span of time, you have moved from living in a world where even though paid print newspaper circulation per capita have been in non-stop decline in the UK and the United States since the Second World War, and even though the average age of the evening news audience on television had been well over 60 and incrementally growing older every year for a long time, you had still occupied the commanding heights of the media environment because there weren't that many alternatives out there, and the ones that were just on the internet, blogs, and so on and so forth, were fairly insignificant because they didn't really command attention at scale the way that incumbent media did. But now suddenly you find yourself in this new world where platforms actually occupy the commanding heights. They account for the plurality of our attention, they capture much of the advertising, they direct attention even to major publishers' sites to great consequence. And you have to navigate this world where you're no longer in the position you used to be. As a media scholar called Russ Neumann wrote many years ago about the early days of the internet, this development is about as welcome as an invasion by Visigoths or Vandals if you are one of the incumbents, but you still have to find your place in this world. To understand how publishers do that, I think we have to start with just this really basic empirical observation, which is that because platforms empower their partners, publishers have, despite their manifest vocal and explicit reservations, continually engaged with them over these more than 20 years. Why? Because the platforms offer them things that they would like to do. They empower them in addition to leaving them more dependent. And the fundamental reality is that there are no platform opportunities without platform risk. Demand media could not have chased all the traffic that they could gather from Google search without taking on the risk that if Google search changed, so would their traffic. Later, publishers such as BuzzFeed could not build up the reach they had on social via Facebook without also taking on the risk that if Facebook changed, so would their fortunes. There are no platform opportunities without platform risk. So what is it that platforms offer news publishers to draw them in as potential complementers to their services and products? I love the early quotes from these companies because they're wonderfully direct compared to the sort of PR waffle that one tends to get at later times. This is Eric Schmidt again, the then CEO of Google, who in this sort of rather imperial pronouncement said, "We have decided that the value we provide the partners is the traffic." So where does that leave the news publishers? Then executive chairman of News Corp, Rupert Murdoch, argued that this approach that Google was the most prominent example of, but far from the only example of, meant that we as societies have entered an epochal debate over the value of content. Where are we with that debate? Some 15 years later, we are in a world where most people, every day, show that they believe that the monetary value of most of that online news content is zero. Most internet news users around the world do not pay for any news. even the minority who do pay for some of the online news that they use, at least in our survey research, has as a median number of news subscriptions 1 title, and on average use 3 or 4. So even those who do pay may well consume more for free at the point of consumption than what they pay for. And that is for news, professionally produced news journalism, let alone the much wider universe of online content. And in that sense, it shouldn't be shocking to us to recognize that most platforms, big and small, do the same. So where does that leave the publishers? It leaves the publishers in a world where the basic terms of trade between most platforms and most publishers has, for more than 2 decades, been access to content in return for access to audience reach. How have publishers responded to this? We outlined 3 responses in the book. I'll just whisk through them very quickly. I'm conscious of time. I want to make sure we have some time for discussion and questions. Some publishers adopted collaboration, others coexistence, and some confrontation. Collaboration is the stance. This can be win-win. The idea that platforms provide opportunities and publishers can complement the platforms but also benefit from this themselves. This is essentially a stance taken by what other publishers call the platform darlings, those who are allowed or invited to collaborate, and many of whom then seek this out through product launches, product development, and early access to tools. The modal stance is coexistence. We need Facebook. Facebook does not need us, as one local German newspaper publisher told us. They know that platforms aren't forces of nature. They aren't just like the weather, but they might as well be if you are a local publisher and have no access, direct access to collaboration or any other way of interacting directly with anyone at the companies. And finally, then, of course, a few news publishers adopted a sort of more confrontational approach. News Corp and Axel Springer in Germany are the most prominent examples of this, with Rupert Murdoch calling the platforms content kleptomaniacs and thieves, often interestingly on another platform, namely what was then still known as Twitter. So where might we go from here? From the point of view of news publishers, this is a grim reality that we live in, right? Their business has been disrupted. Their access to audiences has fundamentally changed. They have to deal with these intermediaries, and they are subject to all these forms of power that are exercised by organizations that create opportunities but also compete with them. Some of this is for publishers to navigate, but there are also questions about how we as a society might think about this, right? So there are regulatory and policy responses. At the macro level, we can see more broadly a discussion around competition enforcement that is increasingly urgent in many countries. We have more radical ideas of breaking up the biggest platform companies. Lina Khan, before she became chair of the FTC in the United States, was a prominent advocate of this. We have approaches more narrowly around news to force at least some of the platforms to pay at least some of the news publishers. This has been passed in Australia. There are discussions in Canada. There are conversations around this in some other jurisdictions. There's been ideas around the creation of publicly funded public service platforms in this country, advocated by then Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, and often an idea identified with the political left. But it's not only the political left who has advanced this idea. On the European continent, Ulrich Wilhelm, the former speechwriter for the conservative Chancellor Angela Merkel, has been a big proponent of the creation of what he calls a European YouTube, so a sort of a public service platform, in his case, an idea advanced from a more conservative point of view. Of course, there are also other possible responses that circumvent platform power a little bit and tries to more address some of the possible disruptions of the role of journalism and news specifically that are being considered in different markets or already in place. You could, for example, subsidize business models that are found to be insufficient to provide the amount of journalism that we might feel we want as a society. You can provide indirect subsidies, such as tax exemptions or VAT exemptions or reductions. There are various forms of systemic support that are in place in some societies to produce R&D, training, professional development, and the like for journalism to help the profession and industry adapt to a changing reality. And there are countries in which you have competitive grants, the way that scientists or artists apply for grants from funding bodies, that journalists and news media could do the same. But fundamentally, publishers probably have to navigate this on their own. As one CEO of an American newspaper publisher told us in our interviews, he said, we plan our future on 2 premises. One is that print will disappear, and the other one is that the policy environment will remain broadly the same from our point of view. So publishers might be on their own. Some of them try to band together in collective negotiations. Some of them lean into this idea of being complementers to platforms. This has not worked so well when platforms have been very mercurial for news publishers. But of course, the wider media environment is one in which the app development and the game developer scenes are largely reliant on a few big platforms and are very large industries, and for some companies, quite profitable industries. So hard, but perhaps not entirely impossible. There are publishers who try to collaborate to build joint tech solutions to reduce their reliance on platforms. But fundamentally, individual publishers' interests and strategies vary. They have things in common, yes, but they are one another's major competitors. And of course, there are often many years of bad blood between them because they may not see eye to eye on issues of editorial principle and the like. Despite this concern about the changing environment, the publishers continue to engage, as I said from the outset, because platforms empower their partners. Publishers have, despite their reservations, continually engaged with them. And this is not just the case for the incumbent large platforms such as Google Search and the various parts of Meta. It is also the case when it comes to platforms who have risen to relative prominence well after publishers recognized how fraught the relationship between publishers and platforms is. So take two very different platforms that have risen to prominence since we finished the book: Spotify for streaming of audio and TikTok for primarily short-form video content. Most major English language publishers use both of these platforms for their own purposes, do so after 10 years or more of very fraught relations with other platforms. But if we then look at who the named content partners of these two platform companies are, the ones that have been incentivized either with data subsidies, product subsidies, or monetary subsidies to come onto the platform and enrich it to draw users into the platform, but also creating opportunities for the partners. They are musicians, celebrities, sports franchises, and not news publishers. So these platforms are not incentivizing news publishers to use them, and news publishers with 15, 20, 25 years of manifest concern and reservations about relying on platforms are flocking to use them anyway. Right. The terms of trade have been established. Will generative AI change the relationship? Many journalists and most major publishers are exploring ways they can use generative AI, and they may have a stronger IP case around training data sets than they have around fair use in search and social of snippets. But who are the biggest players that can empower them if they want to deploy Gen AI at scale, and that they in the process may also become more intertwined with and dependent upon? Some familiar logos, right? So finally, societal implications, and I'll be joined by Phil on the stage. For a long time, well before Sarah and I began work on the book, I think social scientists interested in media and platforms have been arguing that this sort of dynamic of individual empowerment and dependency is key to understanding our role and our relationship as end users with the platforms we rely on. If you choose to use search, if you choose to use social, if you choose to use e-retail and e-commerce and the like, you do it because they help you do things you would like to do, and you do it knowing that relying on them also leave you more dependent upon them. Not an uncomfortable place to be, but it's still one that we make day in and day out. And to boil down our argument in the power of platforms in a single sentence, I suppose our argument there is that we live in a world in which we increasingly see the same apply for institutions. Previously powerful institutions, such as the news media, are themselves in a similar dynamic with the platforms, increasingly empowered and therefore engaging with, but also more and more dependent upon and therefore uneasy about platform companies. And this leaves us in a place where there is an increasingly urgent need for discussions of platform governance. This has really kicked off in the years since. I claim no causal effect. I mean, it was bubbling up, and there were many scholars who had argued for this for some time, and there were some countries where this has been going on for some time. But it's clearly there is in a broad sense of governance, a question about how do we as a society think about these companies and their power, and what it means to govern it in our lives. And in a sense, as we think about that, I would simply leave you with this slide, which is that it's our individual and aggregate choices that make platforms powerful, right? They don't possess anything themselves. It is through the networks they enable that they exercise power, and that individual platforms may wax and wane, but there are powerful cultural, economic, and technological factors that underpin platform companies and platforms as a form. So they are here to stay, even if some individual companies may run into trouble or perhaps even disappear at some point in time or be much reduced. Platforms as such are here to stay. And that, I think, leaves each of us with this question about how you think we should respond individually, but also collectively. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you for your tour, especially of some of the latest issues. While we warm into questions, and I'll remind everybody we have an online audience who may contribute some questions too. I'm curious, Rasmus, about some of the specific responses that have emerged in the last 6 months. So, the MacArthur Foundation has put $500 million right into local news, and Canada has passed its bargaining code. So, are there any beams of hope in these projects, or are there things you like about the projects, or questions you would have about some of these big opportunities?
Thanks, Phil. I mean, I think both what was passed in Australia, the so-called news media and platform companies bargaining code, which was one of the inspirations, not the only, but one of the inspirations for the Canadian code. Like many others, I have, scholars are rarely just happy and cheerleading. Numerous reservations about the actual form these legislations have taken. I think there is a very real risk that they reinforce incumbents, both on the publishing side and the platform side, and that they give both publishers, platforms, and to some extent policymakers a vested interest in the status quo, and that they do so in ways that are very opaque in a world where I think citizens increasingly demand transparency, both from public authorities, news publishers, and platform companies. So I think the Australian code had a lot of these problems, and Twitter, as a smaller platform, and many smaller online publishers pointed this out, and the code was still passed. My understanding is that the Canadian code takes some steps to contain some of these problems, but I think there is a very real risk that whatever the stated intentions, that the effect of some of these legislations is to already entrench incumbents, both on the tech side and the publishing side. But what I do think that they do that is very important and very constructive is that they dispel with the illusion of sort of learned helplessness, this, oh, but we can't do anything sense from politicians and policymakers. Media policy scholars describe the modal approach of elected officials to media policy as deliberate non-intervention, which is this pretense that we can't do anything. There are tools available. I have reviewed many of them with colleagues working for Reporters Without Borders and published a long and boring report with options of sort of evidence-based media policy options that are available. Something can be done. There are choices to be made, and I think both Australia and Canada illustrates that is the case. In terms of the sort of American approach, a sort of large philanthropic gestures, look, I'm really glad that the MacArthur Foundation and the Knight Foundation and others are really stepping up and investing money here. I think we should sort of carry two things with us as we think about how that incredible commitment of philanthropic money, that generosity on behalf of those foundations, is how that is playing out. One is to just recognize that $1 billion is small change compared to the fundamental change that's happening in the media economy overall. So the American newspaper industry alone was well over $60 billion a year in revenue 20 years ago, and it's less than $20 billion a year now. And something in the order of about 20% of that revenue was invested in newsrooms. So, 20% of 40 billion, that's a lot of jobs that are gone, right? And a one-off commitment of $1 billion is, welcome, but it's spare change compared to what's happened. And the other is and I know the foundations are very conscious of this, so it's not a criticism of them, but I think it's very important to keep in mind, as we also try to do in industrial policy or other forms of philanthropy, that if you pour $1 billion into a model that is a poor fit for the world in which we live, that may extend that model for a few more months or years, but it ain't gonna solve the fundamental problem of what that model faces. So.
Okay. Thank you. Let's open it up. Perhaps we'll start here. Thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, I mean, basically, do you think that Google and the likes of Google are likely to start funding news, though? Their own agencies?
Thank you. I think there is a alternate reality in which that could have happened. It's a matter of public record that Google considered buying the New York Times when the New York Times was in dire financial straits about 10 or 12 years ago. And there has been, I think, good reason to believe that they have seriously considered potentially acquiring one or more major news agencies. They have decided not to. And they've decided not to because they want to stay on their line of the pitch. And there are many problems that competition authorities are right to be very interested in about the risk of self-dealing when companies both are the market and are in the market. And I think these would be sort of supercharged if they were also news publishers.
But Bezos?
Bezos has, as a private individual, bought the Washington Post. And there are commercial dealings between the Washington Post and Amazon. But I think we know from very public airing of dirty laundry around other issues of the Washington Post that newsroom is a leaky ship when it comes to things that the journalists find problematic or unacceptable. And there has been, to my knowledge, in all the years since Bezos bought the paper, not a single allegation by a single individual working there that it's compromised the editorial integrity of the Post, or that it's soft on Amazon or in any other ways engaged in sort of unsavory dealings. So, maybe these rich people, like other rich people, might sort of buy a paper here and there for any number of reasons. I don't think it's going to be a systematic sort of response. And also, I would say more broadly that from about 2017 till about sort of 2 years ago or so, Google and Meta in particular were making sort of fairly significant commitments of a more sort of corporate charity type to support various kinds of journalism, news media, and media research. I should declare an interest. We have benefited from grants from them as well. But I think it's also clear that Meta came to the conclusion that this was not well received by the industry, and thus they decided to wind down those programs. And if you look at other platform companies, if I were to sort of summarize their perspective on Google and Facebook's relationship with the news industry in a sort of slightly unscientific way, I would say they would rather have bubonic plague than have the kind of relationship with news publishers that Google and Facebook has. So they are very deliberately staying at arm's length from any kind of engagement with news publishing journalists. They're welcome to use their tools, but there will be no programs, no direct involvement, and the like from other platform companies. So in a different world, perhaps, but not where we're heading right now.
Thank you. Please, at the back. Yes.
Hi, thanks. That's really interesting. What do you see as a long-term sustainable future for a really serious newsroom? Is there one, or are we finished?
So look, I'm a person in addition to being a social scientist, and I have my own views about what I think is sort of serious journalism and quality journalism. I'm also a social scientist, and in that sense, I'm very focused on the idea that different people have different values and different needs and different things that they appreciate in society. The way I think about it, very crudely put, is that the kinds of journalism that serve people like me, who are sort of rich, highly educated, willing to spend time, maybe even a bit of money for news, is doing very well. It's growing in many cases, and we're heading into sort of a golden age of upmarket, elite-oriented journalism. again, I think many of us in the room are old enough to remember a world before digital, right? I mean, I grew up in a small village in the countryside in Denmark. If I wanted anything but a few print newspapers and state monopoly television, I had to take the train to Copenhagen, right? Whereas now I have a dozen news apps on my phone, and for a relatively modest fee, I can read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the FT, the Economist, and many other things. And these companies are doing well. So news for people like me, things are looking great. I'm very concerned about news for the majority of the population who are not willing to pay for these titles and who often aren't interested in using them even if they were free because they feel that they reflect and represent a worldview and a lived experience that's very different from their own. So if you have a supplement like the FT used to have called How to Spend It, and both the editorial content and the ads suggest who your imagined readers are, you know, if you make the median household income, let alone less than that, you might, you know, full well see, well, this is not for me, right? And the commercial incentives that were the power of commercial broadcast investment in television and in popular newspapers, which, you know, we can have different views on the merits or demerits of some of those titles, but they also played an important role. Those commercial incentives are disappearing as we speak. So I think that there are alternative scenarios possible, but I think the most likely scenario is what I think of as a retreat, where journalism retreats to its origins as being a profession and an industry that's primarily oriented towards the commercial and political elite and the people immediately around it, and comes to play a role akin to sort of classical music and contemporary art and theater, just without the subsidies. And that it sort of is, I think, a very real risk of losing touch with much of the public. And I think that is my personal view is that's quite sad because it really was, at least for a brief moment in time, with its imperfections, a form of popular enlightenment, and I think we're losing that.
Please.
Thank you. My first question was about like whether we would be getting misinformed, but I think you just covered this. And to build on top of that was more like, how can we get good news if we don't want to spend the time and energy to kind of do what you do and really kind of dig for the right information? Because I would kind of expect as a citizen to get informed well without all the additional restrictions and whatever you apply to get the right news.
Thanks. As I think was clear from what I just said, I shared your concerns, but I also sometimes I sometimes sort of wonder at how we came to think of the world this way, right? And I'm thinking of an old book published more than 100 years ago by the American journalist and commentator Walter Lippmann called Public Opinion, where he writes, amongst other things, that for most people, a free press means one provided for free. And I do think it's kind of curious, right? I mean, in America, the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates there are something like 50,000 journalists. That's a tenth of the number of university professors. And that we sort of sometimes I think, risk-taking for granted that there are professionals who are uncovering information that powerful organized interests would rather have that we don't know about and make it available for us for free in an easily accessible format is a kind of an extraordinary thing. Now, I share this too, right? I don't pay for most of the news that I consume. So I'm not unsympathetic to the way you describe it, but I just think it's worth wondering about why do we assume this and why do we sort of expect this? Of course, one approach to providing it is public service funding for genuinely independent public service media, which is a very, very rare phenomenon. It exists in this country, it exists in a few countries in continental Europe and a few others, but it's very rare at a global stage. And honestly, I don't think you could create it if it didn't exist. I mean, if you stood up in Parliament and suggested we will introduce a poll tax that's the same for a millionaire and for someone scraping by, to create a gigantic bureaucracy in London with tens of thousands of people that produce news that most people take only a fleeting interest in, I mean, you'd be shouted down. I mean, there are models that are public, if you will, but they require a sort of collectively binding decision that I think are hard to make. So I have to say, I think as citizens, we have to be willing to pay attention to journalism, even with its imperfections, and sometimes we have to wonder about whether we also want to pay the same for news as we pay for a cup of coffee. And those of us who are privileged enough to be able to make that choice, I think we really should, but that's a normative decision. That's for each of us to decide.
Thank you. Let me take a question from the online audience. Rasmus, could you say a little bit about how this ecosystem dominated by strong platforms may have had a role, perhaps a supporting role, in the production of misinformation, especially related to science and climate? And are you worried at all about the small players that are non-traditional news actors that seem to be producing news on specialty issues, especially those involving controversy like climate?
I'm going to park the one about sort of smaller sites. I think, in a sense, smaller sites are as diverse as larger news publishers, and in the sense sort of probably deserve their own sort of full treatment. So I'll leave that one aside and focus on the platform question. So I tried to sort of get at this empirically, working with two colleagues, Sasha Altai and Richard Fletcher, where we use ratings by a private company called NewsGuard that tries to rate on a scale from 0 to 100 what they consider the trustworthiness of different sources of information. Anything below 60 is considered sort of untrustworthy, and then there are a worse number of sites that they identify as having repeatedly published outright false information that they score 40 or lower, and then everything above 60 is, broadly speaking, what they would regard as trustworthy. It's important to be clear that that is quite an accommodating category. There were some people who had a field day when NewsGuard rated Fox News trustworthy. Mail Online was briefly at 59 in this country, and then there was what I think we can interpret as a sort of a lawyers at dawn type moment where suddenly it became 60 and then it was trustworthy. Using these ratings, we tried to assess the relative share of relatively untrustworthy sources in people's online information intake in a range of countries for a number of years, including the pandemic years. Overall, the picture we find is that the vast majority of the news that people engage with comes from sources that NewsGuard regard as trustworthy in this broad conception of trustworthiness. So essentially largely established players and their digital counterparts. The large majority, well over 90% in most markets, well over 95% in some of online traffic. But when you look at the number of Facebook interactions that the same sites generate, it's still the case that the large majority of interactions are with trustworthy sites, but there is a larger share of interactions that are with untrustworthy sites on Facebook than on the open web. So there is something going on here where this stuff gets more traction, at least on Facebook, probably also on other social platforms. You have researched this with your team more than I have, probably also on other platforms. And furthermore, as I think many journalists would be the first to stress, the platform environments don't operate with a categorical distinction between news and content, right? So it also risks blurring the boundaries between news and, say, opinion or just stuff. And in that sense, it may create even more space for various forms of problematic information. I will say on that last bit that it is worth at least considering whether we as citizens believe that news media have always been very good at maintaining that iron distinction between news and opinion or news and other stuff. You know, views will differ on this, and I think we're each entitled to our own views on that. But broadly speaking, I would say I think it's clear that the large platforms have facilitated the spread of very problematic information. They have let themselves be used by both very powerful actors who spread such information. I can think of a till recently president or two or three or four or five, but also by unscrupulous networks, either of engaged activists who spread false information for political gain, or just scammers who are using it to generate clicks for advertising. And they have struggled to find their feet in responding to it because they are keenly aware that a lot of this misinformation, broadly conceived, is legal speech. And if and when they crack down on it, increasingly they will be publicly criticized for censoring those who express themselves in ways that are legal, and they will be accused of doing so in ways that are politically motivated and biased against or for one or other political forces. And that is a very uncomfortable place to be, in particular if you're a large platform company who want to serve everybody. So.
Thank you. Yes, please. Hi.
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm a fellow at the Reuters Institute. I was really curious about, with the platform power, this idea of secrecy and the asymmetry of information, especially with sort of the opacity of algorithms and how that might intersect or contribute with this distrust in media in general, with things like the media isn't showing us this, or fear of shadow banning and things like that. And if so, if there's a way to counter that.
Thank you. So we've run a big project on trust in news for some years at the Institute. Amongst other things, we did lots of interviews with journalists and editors and had roundtables with journalists and editors. And the corrosive impact of platforms on trust in news is like one of the first things that journalists and editors will bring up. And I understand why. It's essentially stated as a fact that platforms have a corrosive impact on trust in news. It was very interesting when we did the interviews and focus groups with citizens, very few people mentioned it, and they talk about other things entirely than about platforms. They talk about not being very familiar with news. They talk about feeling that news is very negative, that it's very commercially motivated, that's probably in the pocket of politicians. They talk about news organizations, journalists coming across as having other values or other experiences than people like the citizen in question. So they talk about very other things than platforms. Now, neither of these things can be taken as sort of hard evidence of the impact of platforms and trust in news. The fact that journalists are convinced they have a negative impact is not proof they do, and the fact that few citizens mention it is not proof that they don't, right? So we try to get at it in a different way. The work is still under review, and it's one of those things where we're very conscious that sort of great claims require great evidence, a sort of article that as a scientist I take very seriously. I'm happy to sort of trail it by saying that we think that there is pretty strong quantitative evidence that as over time, the relative prominence of television as a source of news declines, and the relative prominence of social media increases, that overall trust in news, controlling for other factors, is likely to erode over time. Our interpretation of why that might be is that the sort of paradigmatic experience of getting news on television is that you get a authoritative account that is not challenged while you get it, right? I mean, the famous Walter Cronkite sign-off, and that's the way it is, was not followed by a comment field with like 500 people saying, "You're off your rocker, Mr. Cronkite." Now, it's worth remembering that the bulk of my field as a media researcher spent the last 50 years criticizing this model, right, as being sort of undemocratic, basically, and sort of hegemonic. But the paradigmatic experience of encountering news online, on social in particular, is that someone says, "This happened," and then you encounter it in the context of someone saying, "Can you believe these idiots believe that this happened?" Or can you, isn't it completely transparent that they're only saying this happened because they are in the pocket of this, or because they are trying to convince you that why? I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit for comic effect, of course, but we believe that we have sort of evidence to suggest that the rise of social media and the decline of television can be a contributing factor, even as other things are probably more important for determining public levels of trust in news. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that depends on whether you believe news is trustworthy in the first place. And that probably varies by source and by country and perhaps by personal inclination.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I hope you'll stay. Join us for some one-on-one conversation and a drink, and have a look at the books, which will be on sale at the back. Join me in saying thank you to Professor Nielsen.